So it is hard to believe, but this is in fact the first week of Advent, the season that leads up to kind of our celebration in Christmas. Just kind of a quick reminder, Advent is the Latin for coming or arrival. We're, of course, celebrating and remembering both the original carnation and Christ's coming when he'll fully establish the kingdom. So it's this idea of coming, it's this idea of establishment. It is just historically, it's something that's kind of modeled on Lent. This idea of building anticipation, of anticipating originally Easter and the celebration of the resurrection, but also this darkest time of year, I think, was selected for its themes of light, of God breaking in and surprising everyone when Christ was incarnate in a very unlikely place to a very unlikely people to do some very amazing things in human history. And the kind of rhythm of how we remind ourselves of this story and how this story is told every year is interesting in that as Advent starts, we start with kind of the eschatology piece, right? We actually start almost backwards. We start at the end of time and celebrating Christ coming again when all things will be made right and restored. And we work our way back into the incarnation when Christ was actually born, and that's when we get to the birth narrative. So again, this is the first week of Lent. That's kind of a quick overview on Lent is and why it maybe is important. But the first reading we're going to look at is, like I said, from this kind of eschatological end times sort of thinking, and we're going to look at this beautiful passage out of Isaiah chapter 2. So let me start by reading that. The word of the Lord that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of all mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, he shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So, the book of Isaiah generally is almost bipolar. He seems to like juxtaposing often these very harsh teachings about judgment or the coming exile or the unfaithfulness people with these deeply hopeful ones that are almost shockingly hopeful based on the situation of people who are about to go into exile, right? So we're getting the second half of those, like we said, a celebrated passage for eschatology. It's a celebrated passage for Advent, again, because these are passages that the New Testament is going to use to apply to Christ. Christ is bringing about this sort of a world, both in his original incarnation and then again in the second one, in which the kingdom will be established totally fully. But in the book of Isaiah itself, this juxtaposition, which is so easy to miss, of the very harsh, judgmental, of how badly God's people are screwing up, with this hopeful scene of God working beyond even their latest, biggest dreams, is a really important thing for just understanding kind of how Isaiah itself as a book works overall. So this first section, it shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. From out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So it's an interesting kind of reminder of where human history is going, because if you think about it, Jerusalem is a pretty unlikely kind of center of history. It's a very unlikely place for pilgrimage and all these other places to go. I mean, it's just not much of a mountain. compared to maybe some of the grandeur or the ones that we're used to. It's not much of a temple in the ancient world compared to these big, massive temples they're making in Egypt and Assyria at the time. They're not much of an empire, right? They're not this inspirational kingdom that people are going to come to learn from. It's not considered much of a philosophy, Judaism, compared to the high Greek philosophies of Stoicism or Aristotle's thinking, etc. The key on why this is going to become the center is not have to do with the greatness of God's people in kind of more traditional terms. It has to do with this calling that God has placed on them. They are meant to be kind of an enclave of God's presence on earth. They are meant to be kind of a priestly class, those who are stepping into the gap, those who are inviting the rest of humanity into kind of God's ways. They're meant to be these kind of exhibitors of God's ways, right? Because the ultimate claim of what makes Jerusalem at this point, the culmination of human history, what makes them so great is the fact that God is there. God is among them, tabernacling is the Old Testament word. God is in his presence. God is incarnating in an Old Testament sort of way. God is among God's people, and therefore people are going to want to come. And so this dream that is being, I think, expressed here and thrown out for hope, that Jerusalem, which has just entered exile, whether that's prophetically in Isaiah's day or some of his original audience who are going to experience going into exile when their country is conquered, when they lose their homeland and are taken far away. The dream, the hope that this place that has just been crushed into the dust is in fact going to be the center of human history, that this is going to be a place that all nations come is an amazing claim. The fact that this is going to be a place of pilgrimage where the people who are kind of currently experiencing being scattered among the nations are now going to be a hub, a center in which things come to learn from God and to learn those ways. And that's this kind of second section as well, because again, what they probably want as a people who've just entered exile, who've just received judgments, they kind of want the good old days, right? They just want things back the way that they used to be. And yet God's dream for what this actually means at the end of time is so much bigger. He's going to judge between the nations. He shall decide disputes for many people, and they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this idea of peace and restoration isn't just going back to them as an established kingdom. It's not just going back to the glory days when King David was, the biggest and the baddest, when Solomon had a name for himself, right? It is saying this thing that largely defines culture at the time and in current time. What differentiates the different people groups is largely violence, is largely the ability to dominate one another, whether that's economically, whether that's culturally, whether it's socially, whether it's militarily, right? So much human endeavor, so much of culture, what makes human beings distinct from one group from another, has to do with domination, has to do with violence. And yet God's dream is not just to go back to a time when Israel got to be dominant or could kid themselves that they were dominant in some way, shape, or form. He's going back to the very beginning, back to the Garden of Eden, right? In which people's responsibility to one another and to the world around them is that of gardening, of putting away these things that are meant to kill and destroy, and the definitions of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a culture, is one of care and bringing out the best in some other living thing, whether that's, symbolically other people or very literally the places that we get food from as well. And so it's an incredible dream. It's an interesting hint that there still seems to be some kind of need and differentiation between the nations, that there's maybe still some conflict, but God is directly involved. And then it ends on this, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. And I think it's an important reminder, because even Isaiah, the kind of outsider prophet, right? The one who sees what's going wrong in his nation, isn't saying all these things that are coming in the future that we are not living into right now. It isn't a you, it's an us. Let us come and follow God. Let us follow the way that we are meant to all along. And so I just think it's important to remember why eschatology, why looking at the end of things, why these beautiful utopian dream-like passages are important. The first is this was not the experience of Isaiah and his people at the time, right? They were either experiencing exile or about to experience exile, depending on how you understand the editing and the timing of what's being said in Isaiah. But so much of our experience is tragedy, like exile, or feeling just that things do not fit. It is not this utopian ideal, right? And yet, despite the fact that this passage is very much haunted by loss and by grief, this is not the end of the story. At the end of the story, beyond all of these things, we believe that God is doing something else. God is doing something good. God is going to bring something whole and real and this dream of the garden back in some ways. And so it's an interesting challenge because, again, Isaiah gets the job of offering a lot of judgment because his people were not living into that identity, that place of being a pinnacle, that place of inviting people into God and God's ways, right? They were failing in so many ways. And if the dream is, I think, meant to inspire his contemporaries, saying, okay, at the end of human history, everybody is going to be coming to us because what they're actually looking for in the midst of their violence, in the midst of all the conflict, in the midst of just this searching and this anger and this frustration in the world, what everyone is actually looking for is God. And our job is to represent that, to invite them to the table, to help them meet God, who we claim is living among us at the temple and the tabernacle, right? And so the challenge is, why is it that people who are ultimately looking for God and God's ways, not finding it among us right now? And so I think that was a bit of a knife, a bit of a challenge for Isaiah's people who would go into exile as failures, needing God to not say the story's over because they're failures, because God doesn't really have anything else to work with. But the challenge for us nowadays, too, is people are so desperately looking for God. People are so hungry for the sorts of hope we are supposed to have, for the sorts of things we're talking about in this passage, in Advent overall, that God is good and doing things in the world, and that this thing has a happy ending, so we can have hope. And so the question is, if all this is coming at the end of history, do we really believe, as the New Testament seems to argue, that that's available now? That these tastes of ultimate peace, of people being able to come and experience God's real, true, whole presence, is that something that they can find among us in our communities and our lives? Or is it simply something that's kind of a pie in the sky that we have to be thinking about and dreaming of, and maybe someday it all will work out? It's a tension that we're invited to live into by this passage, by Isaiah's challenges, by Advent itself, the both and the not yet. But again, the question is, if this is what's coming, how are we living into this now? How are we experiencing this now? How are we showing this now? That's the questions we're asking ourselves in Advent.